Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Mylène Simard, and I am an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Nêhiyaw, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Bookseller itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of the Good Walk, creating new paths on traditional prairie trails, a memoir, travelogue, and a manifesto, recounting how a growing group of dreamers instigated prairie pilgrimages on foot starting in 2015 and continuing almost every year ever since. We're grateful to the University of Regina Press and to Camino, Manitoba for helping to pull this evening together. Following the reading and presentation, there will be a question and answer period. I will let Matthew sort of fill you in on that. And if you're one of the people watching from home, feel free to ask a question in our YouTube chat and we will pass it along to the author. I will be back at the end of the presentation for signing procedures, but for now, I have the pleasure of calling up Tyler Gingrich of Camino, Manitoba to introduce Matthew. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good evening. My name is Tyler Gingrich. I'm with Camino, Manitoba. Camino, Manitoba has been around for about 5 years. The overall goal of Camino, Manitoba is to engage with walking as a spiritual practice and to build community. There are lots of walking groups in Manitoba, and our focus is letting go of the non-essentials and connecting. Our walks connect with world traditions of pilgrimage, and we seek to connect with Indigenous wisdom and story. We seek paths of reconciliation with the Indigenous communities, and this has been reflected in a number of the events we've hosted this year. From our walking event with Indigenous artist Casey Adams at the Forks, to our walking tour in April of Roostertown, the Métis community that was situated right in this area. We have an upcoming walk on May 25th with Indigenous knowledge keeper Lance Guibault of the Broken Head Interpretive Trail. And our website is caminomanitoba.ca. Check it out for more information and to keep in touch. I'm also a pastor at Gloria Dei Lutheran Church in Charleswood in the west part of Winnipeg. And I'll acknowledge a number of other Lutheran clergy colleagues and friends that are in the audience this evening as well. I've known about Matthew, also an ordained Lutheran pastor, for quite a while through common connections, and it seems we have some overlapping taste in music and drink as well. If I may begin by asking you to reflect on what brought you here this evening by show of hands. Who is here because they like long walks? Okay. Who here considers them part of a faith community, however you may define that? Okay. Who here just showed up because the book looks interesting? Okay, that's good too. In addition to being an author, Matthew Anderson has produced 2 documentary films, one of them titled Something Grand, and you can watch it on Vimeo. It starts with the question, how would you feel if on your deathbed, your last thought was, did I ever, even once in my life, do something grand? It's an existential question, an invitation to adventure. Perhaps this is even along the lines of what brought you here this evening as well. In the documentary, he reflects on pilgrimage and asks the question, how important is the journey? It's hard to say. A person can go through many spiritual or emotional changes without ever stepping foot outside their door. But there's something about the outside that works its way in, and the inside that works its way out in pilgrimage. something about that landscape that affects our hearts, and something about our hearts that changes the way we look at the landscape. In the early pages of his new book, Matthew reflects on our Canadian experience and what it can mean to walk on this land. If we Canadians really want to make a difference, then we can begin by allowing ourselves sometimes to feel awkward, ashamed, and unsettled. We can demand real change of our governments without so desperately trying to escape the discomfort that comes from the question, what does it mean to be non-Indigenous and on this land? And he goes on to talk about a word, unhomeness, and maybe you can talk a bit more about that tonight too. I'm not sure if that is included in your remarks already, but I found that interesting. Dr. Matthew Anderson grew up on Treaty 4 territory in southwest Saskatchewan. After living many years in Montreal and teaching at Concordia, he now holds a Gatto Chair of Christian Studies at St. Francis Xavier University in Tigonish, Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq. He is a lecturer in diversity, sustainability, and theology. Matthew is married to Dr. Sarah Parks. Welcome, Sarah. A professor at St. Francis Xavier as well. He has 3 grown children and 1 grandchild. In addition to his academic work, as well as a number of award-winning short stories, Matthew has 4 books in print. The titles of Matthew's books say a lot about his interests. Prophets of Love, The Unlikely Kinship of Leonard Cohen and the Apostle Paul. Our Home and Treaty Land, written with Dr. Ray Aldred. Pairings, The Bible and Booze. And of course, the reason we're here tonight, The Good Walk, creating new paths on traditional prairie trails. Matthew also produces the pilgrimage podcast, Pilgrimage Stories from Up and Down the Staircase. On this trip west, he's breaking in new boots for a pilgrimage walk he and Sarah are taking at the end of the month in PEI. I'll note too that while this is the Winnipeg launch of the book, it's actually the launch of the book altogether, because you're going on tour west from here. So we get the actual launch. It's great to have you with us. Welcome, Matthew, and welcome to Winnipeg.
I will say that firstly, welcome, and it is a real honor and privilege for me to be here. I have watched how many great books have been inaugurated, celebrated, feted here at this bookstore. And many of the books that I really treasure have been through here as launches. And so to take my place among those people is really, really special, and I'm very, very thankful. I will say one thing I'm not as thankful for is that we got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, Nova Scotia time, to get the Porter flight, which was a wonderful flight, but we had to get up at 4 in the morning. So 2 o'clock in the morning, Manitoba time, we got up. And so if I if I can't, if my brain sort of goes like this and you're going, what's going on? That's why. But it's great to be here, and it's great also to have the chance to show my partner, Sarah, the prairies, because she has never had the chance to see the prairies yet. And so this is her inaugural, it's the launch of the book and her inaugural trip to this part of the creation. So thank you to Mylène for the land acknowledgement and for the introduction, to Tyler for that wonderful introduction. And unhomeness, I would love to talk about that. Let's put it in a question somewhere so I can. To Dave Berg and the folks from Camino, Manitoba. I almost slip into Camino, Nova Scotia, Camino, Manitoba, for hosting the event and providing a group of people as well who are just interested in pilgrimage. And we had wonderful talks about walking over supper. So thank you to those folks as well. I'm really, really happy to be here. Thank you to each one of you. However, I know a good number of you, and it's wonderful to see those whom I know and to look forward to meeting those whom I don't. The program that we worked out this evening was for me to do a short reading, say a few words, because you can always, you can take the professor out of the university, but how the rest of it goes, and then have the kind of a Q&A. So first, a little bit of reading from the book, if that's all right. That's what we'll do first. And there's so many places. The first one, I think we'll just start off here. As Writer, because many of you are walkers, I saw the hands go up, interested in the subject of long distance walking. As writer and walker Robert Moore points out, the terms that we tend to use interchangeably to describe walking routes can actually mean very different things. Paths, trails, traces, tracks, treks, roads, rambles. Have I forgotten anything? Can you think of another word? Rambles, ways, caminos. They all say something about mobility and they all say something about terrain. Yet no two. Oh.
Strolls.
Strolls. Yeah, that's another good one. A stroll. A meander. How's that one? A meander. Any others? A saunter. And I didn't hear.
A lunt. Lunt. L-U-N-T.
A lunt. Yep. Which means?
It's actually walking with a pipe.
With a pipe. Wow. Okay. Other what's? Other terms? Those are great. But you can see already that they no two mean quite the same thing. Another one might be circumambulation.
March.
A march. Oh yes, a march.
And a forced march.
Yeah, and a forced march. In fact, one of the trails that I describe in the book was a march as well as a meander, as well as a pilgrimage at different times in history. Yeah. One of the things that Robert Moore says that is a path is something we make, a trail is something we follow, and yet we tend to use those terms interchangeably. And he uses a great illustration. He says, for instance, there's a big difference between lying down in the path of a charging elephant and lying down in its trail. In discussions of walking, such differences are often covered over or ignored. Our focus on walking can be local. I don't know if you know Annie Dillard and Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, but there is a local, not so far away author who's somewhat similar in the spirit of Dillard, poet and writer Thelma Poirier, who was at Wood Mountain, still is at Wood Mountain. Thelma Poirier writes in a book called Rock Creek about her explorations on foot through geography and memory. And it's interesting how those overlap. That's part of the point. Geography and memory along the hills and creeks of Wood Mountain, the starting point for our first pilgrimage. In 2015, we were lucky. Prairie took quite a bit of time with us explaining to me things like pemmican caches and how they worked and work. And you can still see the depressions in the soil around Wood Mountain of these pemmican caches. And then visiting us along the road. When Prairie uses the term trails, she's thinking about terrain that tends toward wilderness. The term trail goes with wilderness, whereas the term track tends to connote even rougher kind of terrain. And for most, the term path means something tough or gentle. Gentle. A path is generally gentle, or maybe even walks with the dog along the path. The tracks that we walked in Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 were not well marked. As anyone from the prairies knows, and you folks will know this, they had none of the soft sentimentality of an English garden path. Although I know Assiniboine feels quite, I was fortunate this afternoon that Kaminsky's took me for a very brief walk there, and it felt a little bit English gardenish. But generally, if you're walking straight across the prairie, no. The point is that the paths can be described in very different ways, and definition is important. Descriptions of or stories about a path become part of the path and become part of the path's nature as much as its physical terrain. In 2015, we walked the Traders Road or the Northwest Mounted Police Patrol Trail, and which of those names you use makes a difference. Naming is political, and naming is a way in which we grasp onto some history and sometimes we ignore other history. So the Traders Road or the Northwest Mounted Police Patrol Trail. I faced sometimes gentle opposition in calling our trek a pilgrimage as well. Early on, one of the other walkers, Harold, if you read the book, you're going to fall in love with Harold because everyone does. He tended to call, he took me aside and he said, for you, Matthew, this may be a pilgrimage, but it is not one for me. And when I pressed him on what the trail meant, he said, I'll find out in the walking. Well, he's got some wisdom. In the years since, however, I think he did find his definition of the trail even more in his telling about the walk. And that's the point I want to make. It's not just the walking, it's the story that you tell about the walk. Eventually, he called it a pilgrimage in honor of the changes that that walk brought to his life. This brings me back to Moore's book. And I've come to believe that the narration of our experiences is the crucial moment in framing them. That works whether what we walk is called a pilgrimage, a trail, a groundbreaking path, a therapy walk, or a plain old hike. Land comes with stories. And sometimes we have to create those stories, and sometimes we have to recover those stories, or we work to recover those stories. But the nature of stories is they always change a little bit in the retelling, and we add to them. And the way that we add to them is much the same way that, do you know what desire lines are? Yeah, you've heard that term, desire lines, the shortcuts. The sidewalk goes like this and the desire line goes like this. Well, we make desire lines in terms of stories as well. And in some ways, when we recount stories about paths and our involvement with paths, we create these desire lines in a sort of cultural geography of land. I got completely off the page. I'll go back to the reading, sorry. Land comes with stories, so do the trails across it. Perhaps a version of the undergraduate philosophy class question: if a tree falls in the forest but no one is there to hear it, does it make a noise? You know that question, right? If a tree falls in the forest, no one is there to hear it, does it make a noise? Could be put tongue in cheek to our walks. If the story of an important, traditional, especially Indigenous trail is forgotten, then can settler-descended society get away with pretending that the trail never existed? I believe that this is part of the reason that the 19th century starvation treks made by Big Bear and by Piapot and by many Indigenous men and women and children unknown to us by name, who walked with them, were all but extinguished from Canadian memory. Perhaps unconsciously, Canadians have tried to erase the guilt by expunging the stories and literally plowing over. You see that when you walk these, literally plowing over so many of the trails. They've not been forgotten in Piapot, and they've not been forgotten in Mosquito and other First Nations. Hikers say that the walk makes the walker. Maybe some of you have even said that. The walk makes the walker. But in an interesting twist, the walker also helps define the walk. Although the Northwest Mounted Police were hardly the first to use the Traders Road, the Trail Saskatchewan section eventually took their name. See, that's that back to that. Is that a Traders Road or is it a Northwest Mounted Police Patrol Trail? Perhaps this is because a good trail is always related to a good story. And the story of Sitting Bull and his relationship to Inspector James Morrow Walsh was so strong, so powerful a story. Inevitably, we human beings can't help but tell stories. But every walk or pilgrimage that I've been on was surrounded by stories long before we took our first steps. And it's no different with the 3 walks described in this book. In documentaries and interviews and social media posts, in telling our friends and families about our adventures, we added our own narratives. It's still somewhat rare for decolonizing to be connected to long distance walking. Maybe I should say that again. It's still somewhat rare for decolonizing to be connected to long distance walking. But that connection is what made our walks what I call pilgrimages. Even though not all my fellow walkers agreed at first. Walking was how we moved from the unhomeness that a lot of folks, Canadians, feel without necessarily being able to pin down why, from that unhomeness toward a new understanding of how this place might yet again still become home. I hope that the story of our walking these prairie trails will inspire others to follow us, not literally always, but in some ways. I hope that they, or perhaps you, come carrying packs as we did, or perhaps driving on the nearby roads, or perhaps, as we were talking about at supper, starting in Southwest Manitoba, closer to Pembina, the beginning of the Traders Road. Because these were foot and travois and cart and wagon trails long before we walked them. My hope was that they could be reinscribed in a new way in Canadian perception, if only we could walk them again in the 21st century. I wanted our walks to create new stories about the repressed histories of the trails, and in the process, bring back to public awareness the narratives of ceremony, clearance, and resistance that have too often been forgotten. I hope that this telling might be one small step in living out our treaty obligations, our relations in a good way. So that's the reading. I'm sorry, it was kind of an annotated reading, but so I'm going to come back and ask this question again. How many of you have walked on the prairies? Okay. And so hold that for a second, and I'm going to come back. I'd like to talk about three things. I realize now that I'm actually being recorded, so I can't move too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you three spaces to think about. This is what a book like this says about place, this space over here. This one right above my head is what a book, The Good Walk, says about relation. So place, relation, and then what the title says about the book. So place and relation in the title. Does that make sense? Sort of? You're willing to go with me on this? Okay, good. So here's the thought experiment. Please close your eyes, think of the prairies, and say to yourself quietly the word home. So think about the prairies and say to yourself the word home. Just take a moment to do that, if you would. Think about the prairies, close your eyes, and say the word home, and whatever image bubbles up, let it bubble up. Prairies, home, and an image. All right, you can open your eyes again. And tell me, does anybody want to say anything about what image came to mind? What play? Yeah. Big sky. Yeah. Now, was the sky red? Was it a sunsetty sky? No, just a big sky. Okay. With clouds. Yep. Yeah. Sounds good. Do you want to say where? You don't have to, but.
Home for me is up north in the Boreal Forest.
Okay, so it's forest landscape for you. Okay, perfect. So the smells and the sounds of forest. Okay, good. I actually can get that. Thank you. Yep.
Aurora Borealis.
Yes, especially last night. Yeah. Yeah. So Aurora Borealis. Yeah. Yeah. Now Aurora Borealis, cold. Like what's going on temperature wise when you're watching this in your mind? Is it cold or is it hot? Cold. Yeah. I used to deliver newspapers in Swift Current, the Northern Lights, and cold.
They were best in the way to these in my childhood in rural Saskatchewan.
Yep. Somebody else had their hand up over here, I think. No? Yes.
On my mother's farm, or where she grew up in southeastern Saskatchewan, the many berries creek flows through a coulee that is there. And every time we get together for a family reunion, we walk out to what's called the Buffalo Stone. It's not a very big rock, but it's rubbed smooth. And the story goes that enjoy rubbing against it.
So is that the image that came to mind for you?
Yeah, it's kind of a touchstone for.
But there's a reason they call it a touchstone. Yeah, I mean, rubbing stones, grandfather stones, as Richard Cotteridge called them. Any others who wanted? Yeah.
The sloughs around the small towns and Saskatchewan.
You may not have heard that at the back, but the sloughs. When you think sloughs, close your eyes and think sloughs. Yeah, I bet you can smell them if you think hard enough. There's a bit of a putrid smell sometimes to a slough. Yeah.
Wheat fields.
The wheat fields. Yeah.
I used to work on the CPR going across, and I got up early those times and see those wheat fields.
Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah, no, the wheat fields. It's the landscape. Thought there was somebody else. No, okay, well, we could, yep.
I was just going to say, rather than seeing, I hear.
Yep.
I hear the red-winged blackbird and the wind in the grasses, and that it's more auditory.
Yeah. So you can hear the red-winged blackbird the winds in the grasses, the whisper of the grasses. No meadowlarks necessarily, no red-winged blackbirds for you, okay? Well, let me segue from what you just said to this. When you closed your eyes just now and thought about prairie and home, I am betting that most of you imagined something that I'm going to call a place. And I'm going to distinguish a place from a space. Now, there's a whole academic discussion here, and it's far more nuanced, but for now, I'm going to say place and space are two different things. A space is a dot on a map. A place is that same dot on the map once you add in memories and feelings, and maybe auditory sounds like the red-winged blackbird, or smells like the slough, or visions like the aurora borealis. A space is a container. A place is the lemon meringue pie that your aunt made, or the farmer's sausage and pierogies that you put into the container and the memory of how that tasted. Space is neutral. You can buy it, you can sell it, you can use it for something, and then use it for something else. You can trade it and then give it away. There is a reason our society tries to make places into spaces. And it's because space is more commercially exchangeable. As I say, a place is never neutral, by contrast. You and I are always in some kind of a relationship to a space. As I say in one of my books, 336 10th Avenue Swift Current is just an address. If you fed that into GPS or into Google Maps, it would just be the address, it's a space. Anything could be there, but once I tell you that 336 10th Avenue Swift Current is a 2-story house with a big front porch where I used to watch dragonflies when I was 4 years old and be scared by them, that it had a big tree in the front yard where my brother, I tried to catch my brother one time, and he almost broke my arm because I was trying to be a good big brother and catch him, that there was rhubarb in the backyard, in the back alley where we kids played. I remember listening to the local radio station. I remember a big great horned owl sitting on the branch and looking back at us. Well, what's happening? That space is being turned into place by my memories. Wherever you imagine was a place for you. Of course, the academic discussion, as I said, is more complicated, but at its most distinct, at its most basic, this distinction tells us something that's really common sense. And that is that once we make memories of a place, it becomes meaningful for us in a new way. And if we empty memories from a place, that can be a tragedy. So point number 2, this was place. The one above my head is relation. I hope you can see what's coming. Relation is one of the ways that we turn space into place through relation. So places are spots or water bodies or trails. In my case, we develop a relationship to. This thing is about not making places, but it's about remembering places before they turn completely into spaces. So I hope that you too, if you read this book, will develop a connection to the Traders Road and the Battleford Trail and the Frenchman Trail, and start thinking about the Pembina Trail or other trails here locally, like Camino, Manitoba engages in. And that you will also be a part of this path, or the urban paths of Winnipeg. How do you turn a space into a place or remember a place? Partly through relationship. And that is a relationship to land. You have a relationship to land. You walk out to that stone, David, and that rubbing stone, and you walk out as a group. So there's a group thing going on as well. There's a relationship, a group going on at the same time tied to land. Indigenous peoples, of course, were the first peoples to have relationship to the land here. And they still do. Treaties shared the land, but they never gave it up. And you know how if you get into a relationship with somebody, it's not just them, it's also their family. Like, so Sarah came into a relationship with me, but it wasn't just me, it was also my kids. She couldn't avoid that. She came into a relationship with me, it was also my kids. The same goes for treaties. And we sometimes don't think about that. When we historically came into relationship with Indigenous peoples through treaty, we committed to getting to know their relations. And how often do we think about that? To getting to know their relations. And one of their main relations, of course, is land. It's the land as an other, the land as a being that they're in relationship with. When we walked in 2015 and 2017 and 2018, we learned more about the land by going slow and paying attention. And of course, that's the great thing. You know about walking. Those of you who are walkers or think a lot about walking, what is the great thing about it? The great thing about it is it's inefficient, it's slow. Actually, it's quite efficient physically, but it's slow. When you go slow, you might not get from here to Carmen, Manitoba. I don't know how far it is to go there by walking, but it'd be a long way, right? It'd take a long time. But if you ever did that walk, I bet you'd learn that land super well. And Camino, Manitoba folks, when you walk around Winnipeg, walk along the rivers that make Winnipeg what it is, you learn the place in a whole new way. You can do this in the city, by the way, as much as the country. It's a different kind of thing that you notice, but you notice a lot of things in the city too by going slow. So the relationship, one of the last things I'm going to say is that it's no mistake that there are seven people on this cover and not one. This is a book about walking, but many books about walking have one person on the cover. And this one has 7 on the cover, and that's on purpose. It's not a heroic journey. I mean, it sometimes felt that way a little bit, but it's not one person's heroic journey, this book. It's a community. It's a community of walkers and a community engaged in the walk. It's about Richard Cottowich, who was our first pilgrimage elder, a Métis, a teacher who died about a month ago, or 6 weeks. He died about a month before this book came out. And he wrote the preface for it. I did get him the PDF proofs before that, and I think he read them, although I'm not sure, I think he did. But it's about him, it's about his life. It's about Louise, half sky dancer, who smudged us every morning. It's about Connie and Harold and Hugh and Stu and Catherine and Madonna and Larry and Tara and so many other people. So these walks were not like the Camino in Spain. The Camino was great. I love the Camino. I did a documentary film that Tyler was kind enough to point out about the Camino in Spain. But you can frankly walk the Camino in Spain and not have that much to do with the locals, except maybe their wine, which is really good. The Camino is a great place to get in touch with yourself, to do some self-therapy, to find new friends amongst the floating pool of whoever is walking at the time. It's a good place for instant community and safe adventure and maybe rethinking your life and doing something grand. All of those things, it's great for all of those things. But walking on the prairie is not that, and never will be. It's not something particularly to do alone, although some people have. But the walks in the book were about building relations with McCord and Makota and Hutterite colonies and First Nations and farms and ranches all the way along. So the last thing then is the thing over here, the title. How do you pronounce this book title? Can anybody tell me? How do you pronounce it? How would you pronounce it?
The Good Walk.
Okay, The Good Walk?
Good walk.
The Good Walk. Did anybody read it and think, because somebody told me one time, they said, I love your book, The Good Walk. And I thought, oh yeah, you could think of it that way, The Good Walk. But you notice the differences, and depending on how you pronounce it. It can be a book, it can be The Good Walk, meaning a really, really tough, long walk. And if you say it that way, it might be about the space and the place. A good walk, meaning a good slow down and notice everything kind of a trip. That would be good. But I've always thought of it in the same way, The Good Walk. And that's because it was if you haven't read it, there was a Lakota elder in Wood Mountain, Lakota First Nation, who smudged us when we first started off in 2015. And he said, go and walk the good walk. And he meant, walk a walk where you notice the land, where it becomes a relationship for you, where you take in what it gives you as a gift, and you develop more of a relationship and an understanding of the history of that land. So in the end, that is what the book is for me. And so I'll end with that. It's called The Good Walk. And that was my professorial talk about the book. Now, so I want to thank you for your interest in the book, and I want to welcome you to the stories about walking and discovering land, and maybe to the stories that they will inspire in you too, in turn, for maybe other lands. And maybe you will be like those animals who create new paths and slight deviations and stuff by making your own walks. What I'd like to do is have a couple of questions. We're going to split the questions in. Are there some questions written down?
You can pass your questions to the audience. Or just shove them out.
Okay, I think Milan has. What were you doing back
Just like the Wizard of Oz back there. I'm running the tech back there.
I think we're
Ready
going.
for questions?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I will approach you with the microphone if you have a question, so please feel free to lift up your hand.
Soma, you're a pastor and a theology professor. So how does all this relate to theology?
Wow, okay. Well, the cheap response would be to refer you to my other book, which I wrote with Raymond Aldred, who is a professor of theology at the Vancouver School of Theology, and it's called Our Home and Treaty Land. And Ray wrote half of the book, and I responded to it basically. So it's his statements as an Indigenous professor of theology and my reactions as a settler. And I will say that I don't know if I'm a particularly good theologian, because my studies were always in biblical studies, which tends to be more strictly history. And so I'm always a bit nervous around theology, which I know is mea culpa as a minister. Well, I'll tell you, I'm thinking about it. I think the best theology is always rooted in land. And Ray has taught me that again, or reminded me of that. But maybe I can say that, people got all excited a few years ago about Celtic theology. And this book has nothing about Celtic theology in it at all. So this is completely off topic. But one of the things that people love about Celtic theology is that it's rooted in land, is that the prayers and the thoughts are rooted in conceptions like the growth of trees and the sun and the moon and the wind, and the prayers include these kinds of things. Well, that's I do not want to appropriate Indigenous, Indigenous to this land theology, but there are some similarities in Celtic theology is a kind of an Indigenous theology of the early British Isles. And if you go to other places, it's somewhat similar. I had somebody say to me, it's not really Celtic theology, it's Celtic / Anglo-Saxon / anybody, frankly, who was living so close to the land at the time. They all prayed like that. And what we've lost sometimes in our urban environments and our post-modern times, mostly modern times, frankly, is that we've lost some of that connection. And so now it's maybe our time to learn again from Indigenous theologians like Ray about what it means to get back to the roots in our own background, not appropriating their insights, but just rediscovering some of those that come from whatever culture we come from. Does that answer? I hope it was an interesting enough side tag.
I don't think you touched on this, but it occurred to me that the real difference in walking that I face is if I'm a solo walker or if I'm with a group. because they end up in two very different places. And I do them for two very different things. Is that, I don't think you can get out of a solo walk what you get out of a group walk.
Did everyone hear that? Can you get out of a solo walk what you get out of a group walk? Thank you for the question, firstly. And then what I'd say is that the best walks that I've undertaken on any trail, like in Norway and Scotland, here in North America, in Turtle Island, wherever, the group walks have always had solo time. And the solo walks have always had a little bit of group time. And the percentages change, but you need both. Like you said, you need the solo time because frankly, you externalize yourself. There's no chance for the meditation that is walking as much when you're talking. So your point, you need the solo time for the things to bubble up. If you've never done this, I'm sure most of you have, and that's why you love it. But in case you never have, I'm betting nobody here hasn't had this experience, but just in case, do go for a walk solo and get bored, because what happens is that important things come up in your mind and heart when you get bored. And the great thing about walking is that if you're able to walk, if you're well-bodied enough to walk, it's one of the conscious activities which is the least conscious, meaning there's a lot of space for other things to happen. It's meditative. So yes, and then sometimes group walking is a way to check those things in a community. And so the best walks are those that combine it, but leave a lot of space for alone time.
Good afternoon or evening or whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good.
Thank you.
My name is Lionel, and I do have another name, nêhiyaw. You made reference to decolonization, having walked, having formed relationships with land, with people, with all kinds of people. What might reconciliation look like from your perspective?
Yeah. You've already learned that I always approach an answer by going around and around. Not trying to avoid anything at all. One of the dangers of people like me, settler descendants, walking on this land is that it was a Métis person who one time said, he didn't encourage people like me to walk on the land because it was too much like people walking around inspecting what they had just stolen, inspecting the stolen goods essentially. And that, I hope it's clear that that's not what I'm talking about, at least in intent. So what might reconciliation look like on this land? I'll tell you I'll situate myself. And my situation is that my father's parents came from Norway and were given a homestead, so-called free land. Well, we know now that wasn't free. And it was taken from others. It was taken from, in this case, well, it was on the border from Blackfoot and nêhiyaw. So, it was their land and remains their land. But they were forced off it by starvation, by violence, and by the residential schools and so on. So anyway, my grandparents were given this land. Why is it that I grew up in Southwest Saskatchewan, knowing the name of the town Assiniboia, but not knowing any Assiniboines, and not knowing why. And my aunts and uncles, we would have, occasionally they'd come up from the field and they'd bring a hammerhead or something. And we were always taught to respect the items, I will say that. But we were kind of taught the shameful thing, which was that we were kind of taught in Southwest Saskatchewan in the 70s, 60s and 70s, that the people who lived there were noble but gone. And that was a lie. And we were not taught that that was a lie. And so going out on the land, and also we were taught it was an empty land until the pioneers came. And one of the things that walking did was that when you start walking in that area, at least, and I bet it's the same here, you start coming across so many lodge rings and so much evidence of dense habitation, not just habitation, but dense habitation over millennia or over thousands of years, thousands and thousands and thousands of years, that you begin to learn that the term settle is a lie, because frankly, we haven't been here that long in the arc of the land. And once you realize that, there's an existential crisis for people like me who go, okay, so the pioneers were not the first ones here. This land has always been occupied by people whose land it still is. And there's evidence, once you get out and go slow, you can see it. The evidence is all around. And once you learn that, you come to this unhomeness, which is that we need to, people like me need to learn to feel uncomfortable for a while, maybe a long while, generations while, until we can honor treaties, until we can live properly and do the good works. I don't know if I answered that question, but I hope that I came somewhere toward it. Thank you.
When I was a young man, I had bought a skidoo, brand new skidoo. It was outside the northern, the bay. And this other old man, who was one of my 50 grandfathers, came up to me and he said, in our language, "Kuan Gundan away." Now it is understood. Do you own this? Literally what the words say. Do you have a relationship with this?
Yeah. Well, at one point in this book, one of the things I say is that maybe the most important thing we did was to be outside on the prairies for 3 weeks. I mean, at a time. Just to be outside. And that way you develop a relationship with the land in a new way. And other people do it without walking, maybe. There are other ways. But for many of us now, walking is a very good way to do that. Thank you.
I have no idea where this question is going to go. I was wondering if there was a point on any one of the 3 trails where the visitor that was you was held by the land and belonged rather than visited as you walked.
I mean, I think the original part of the process originally was more the opposite. I felt like I belonged less and less for parts of it. I got to know it better and better, but I belonged less and less as I saw the indigenous nature of the land and how far I was away from that. In the book, I talk about, it's not primarily a memoir, but I talk about my family history a bit, and I talk about, I had a sister who died before I was born, and whose death at a very young age affected my family. Alcoholism with sort of all kinds of ways, disruptions within my family because of the death of this sister. And she's buried south of Shaunavon in a prairie grave. And at the end, my conclusion is that through a process of unhomeness, which I think Canadians need to go through, we need to say, this isn't our land. It's still an Indigenous land, it's still sovereign. Indigenous sovereignty must still be recognized. Once going through that unhomeness, we may come back to a way of belonging, but it's only going to be, as you said, it's only going to be, how are you in relationship with this? And in relationship with this means in relationship with the Indigenous people who walked with us. You may well agree with that, but I'm just, for me personally, which was the question, I know, I felt most like it. It's weird. We had a Catholic archbishop walking with us and 3 ministers, 2 ordained and a lay minister, I think, at one point. And isn't it interesting that the only ceremony we could all feel comfortable in was when we were smudged by the elders. So I felt at home most when I was being smudged by them. And when I was listening, that's weird to say after talking for 20 minutes, but on the prairies, when you walk, you listen. And so when I was listening, I don't think I ever came to a full, when I end the book by talking about burying my parents' ashes and hoping that maybe we can learn that the word settle might be something like settle like particulates into prairie soil. And that's my hope. Thank you for a good question.
Thanks, Matt. I'm wondering about this feeling of unhomeness and dispossession. And following on from the question about decolonization, is that just a feeling that we pass through, or does it connect up to some sort of material dispossession, or some sort of land back exercise?
So where does the rubber hit the road? It always starts with our own personal story. So that's one of the reasons, for writing this for me and talking about my family growing up in Southwest Saskatchewan. But are there political consequences? Absolutely. And have I come to believe in those political consequences? Absolutely. Even if I think the book is political. I'm not a lawmaker, but the treaties are still in force. And more, I think there's an incredible, I think there's an incredible shell game going on right now where the people know that the courts recognize Indigenous sovereignty and that certain parties are busy cashing in as quickly as they possibly can and leaving, and I will say leaving the Canadian taxpayer to honor that sovereignty that they already know is the way the court cases will go in the future. In other words, they're passing a huge tax. The problem isn't the taxes, they're passing the debt for what they're doing onto future generations of settler descendants, because they know darn well that it's Indigenous sovereignty. So things like crown land sales, that's all I'll say. Crown land is crown land held in trust for treaties. Anyway, people who know much more about the law know much more about that, but I believe that that's what's happening. So yes, where does this have consequences? I think it does. It will have consequences anyway, legally. Can't we make this happen in a better way for everyone, in a good way for everyone, by recognizing it sooner and not letting certain groups profit off of it in the meantime? I wasn't intending to go there.
We actually have a question from a viewer on the YouTube stream. What is a good walk, aka a pilgrimage, that you think all Canadians should do?
I don't believe that there's one land that all Canadians should walk, but I believe that all Canadians should walk the place where they live, recognizing Indigenous precedence and sovereignty. Don't walk it without that, but if you can do that, and that does not mean, by the way, I will say, there's a section in here, it does not mean phoning up the closest band office and saying, I want to go for a walk, who's going to help me? Because of course they're busy and they don't, their job is not to help you do that. But one of the best ways to engage, I'm speaking totally as a settler descendant here, recognizing that other people will have other things, but as a settler descendant, one of the best ways that I found, is, there are Indigenous businesses, lots of them. give them your business. Like hire caterers, hire Indigenous caterers. Go to hotels, B&Bs, places. Do it fun. That's what you do in a small town. And that's what you should do in every small. You go and frequent the local small town thing, and so do that. And so, what the question is, what should all Canadians do? They should walk the local place where they are, and they should get to know it while keeping those things in mind. But it's not the same. Right where I live now in Nova Scotia, it's Mi'kmaq territory, and the walk I need to do is recognizing the Mi'kmaq, also recognizing the Acadians who had a long historic history with the Mi'kmaq, and getting to know that territory. Somebody from Nêhiyaw, Saskatchewan has a whole different path to walk.
We have time for about one more if anybody has another question.
Just a really quick one. Does a pilgrimage need a destination to be a pilgrimage, or can you have destinationless or meandering, wandering pilgrimage?
Did you ever take a class on this? Pilgrimage is something which is expanding, and so historically pilgrimages had destinations, but sometimes we're the path. So Shikoku is a Japanese pilgrimage, which is 88 temples in a circular pattern around an island in Japan. So, Mecca, of course, the Hajj is a destination pilgrimage. Lourdes is a destination. Sometimes the destination is important. You can take a bus, you can fly, you can just go there. Sometimes the walk is important. More and more, any walk which is transformative in some kind of a spiritual way can be called a pilgrimage. And I'm one of the broad definition people in that way. So a pilgrimage is not quite tourism, but there has always been an overlap. Right from before tourism existed as a word, people went on pilgrimage hoping to pick up some souvenirs and see new territory. And so tourism was always held within pilgrimage in the Western tradition and Christian tradition. And then once the Enlightenment came along and the Reformation peeled off the religious aspects of it, it just became tourism. But because people are people and we want transformation, what happens is that even within tourism, people sometimes practice pilgrimage activities. And so you didn't want that theoretical discussion of pilgrimage maybe, but there it is. Thank you.
I think that's a great place to land. All right, well, please join me in thanking Matthew R. Anderson. This evening. Thank you for your wonderful questions, and thank you to Tyler. Thank you to Camino, Manitoba. We're going to move on to the signing portion of the evening, so feel free to line up here. We have some books on the table to grab and get signed. We just ask that you don't forget to pay for them before you leave the store. And if you have any questions, let us know. And thank you, everybody. Yeah, this was a very captivating. And if you would have told me a few weeks ago that I'd just be dying to read a book about people walking around Saskatchewan or something. Yeah, I was really hooked. So yeah, I'm excited. Thank you again.
Yeah.